Good afternoon. On behalf of the California ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the stakeholder call to discuss the 2020 Final Policy Initiatives Roadmap as part of the annual Policy Initiatives Roadmap process. My name is Jimmy Bashar with the ISO Stakeholder Affairs Group, and it's my pleasure to welcome my colleagues in the room here today. Beginning to my left.
Lauren Carr. Megan Pogue.
Rex Cook. Brad Cooper. John Gooden.
Brittany Dean.
Thanks, folks. As with all of our initiatives and recurring processes, the presentation and all related material for this webinar can be found on the Stakeholder Processes webpage, located on the drop-down menu under the Stay Informed tab on our website, and then you would notice the specific initiative under the Recurring Processes section. In addition, calls and webinars are recorded for stakeholder convenience, allowing those who are unable to attend to listen to the recordings after the meetings. The recordings will be publicly available on the ISO webpage for a limited time following the meetings. Of course, the recordings and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without ISO's permission. And finally, if you have any questions, we ask that you please push #2 to enter the queue. And for everyone, of course, we request that you please state the name and the company that you represent. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Lauren.
Thanks, Jimmy. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining this call on the 2020 3-Year Policy Initiatives Roadmap and Annual Plan. This roadmap reflects the policy initiatives the ISO plans to undertake in the coming years, as well as their approximate timeframes. We posted the draft roadmap a few months back in September, and this version incorporates some changes to that. And we'll go over the slides relatively quickly that we've reviewed in the past in the draft, and then focus more heavily on things that have changed since our draft was posted in September. To begin, I'll go over some of the stakeholder comments that we received on the draft roadmap. We received a few of them, and in general, stakeholders support the 3-year roadmap and annual plan. In our last version, we introduced a new process guidelines in which the ISO would aim to draft business requirements and tariffs prior to the finalization of a policy and prior to board approval. Stakeholders support the new process guidelines. PG&E believes the proposed plan is too ambitious, and stakeholders urge for continued policy alignment between the Day-Ahead Market Enhancements Initiative and the Extended Day-Ahead Market Initiative. And on that one, we do recognize that there are interdependencies between both initiatives, and we do have the policy teams working closely to ensure DAME and EDAM align. Next, I'll go into the primary drivers. These have not changed since our draft was posted, and these guide the ISO in determining which initiatives we wanted to include on the roadmap this year. So here are our primary drivers. The first is to manage operational risk resulting from the transforming grid. Second, we'd like to enhance the market in response to changing grid conditions and clean energy goals in California and in the West. We'd also like to continue enhancements to EIM, including integration into the day-ahead market, and provide benefits across the West. We'll also reform the CAISO's resource adequacy rules necessitated by increasing retirements and tightening dispatchable capacity, as well as integrate new technologies to replace operational attributes previously provided by the thermal fleet. Each of the major initiatives we describe in the following slides can be tied to one or more of these drivers. At this time, I'll go ahead and pause for questions before we get into the rest of the presentation, if we have any.
Thanks, Lauren. Not seeing anything on my end yet, but as a reminder, please push #2.
All right, not seeing any questions, we'll go ahead and move on. All right, I'll go ahead and see if there are any questions one more time, since I don't know where we dropped off, but we went over stakeholder comments and the primary drivers, which haven't changed since our last version. So if you have any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. I think we might have gotten cut off as we just asked for questions, so folks, please feel free to jump in the queue now by pushing #2 if you'd like to ask a question.
All right, so we can go ahead and move on. Next, we're going to get into some of the major initiatives that we'd like to highlight as part of this roadmap, and we'll begin with the initiatives that will evolve ISO markets. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Megan Pogue.
All right, everyone, I believe you have seen this slide before, but we'll walk through it briefly again. And we put this at the beginning of the presentation because it is something new that came up and has a cascading impact to the other initiatives we're currently working on. And this is in relation to the deliverability of the CAISO's capacity products. The market quality team within the CAISO completed an analysis effort this summer to identify price formation and efficiency of the CAISO markets from the day ahead through the real time. One of the findings of that result of the price performance analysis identified that the existing real-time flexible ramping product is not fully deliverable. And this occurs largely due to the fact that the real-time FRP is procured behind constraints due to the opportunity cost. And yes, this is problematic in the real-time market. It does impact the EIM. However, the extent of this problem is limited to real-time. You'll note that the real-time flexible ramping product is not a biddable product, and we only procure about 1,000 megawatts in the upward or downward direction. So if you make the assumption that that's 50% deliverable, yes, this is a problem, yes, it needs to be addressed, and we are planning to address this in the Flexible Ramping Product Enhancements Initiative. But this problem becomes worse as you go down the waterfall. So if you go down to the center of the slide and we consider the deliverability of capacity products within the DAME framework, the Day-Ahead Market Enhancements Framework. If we continue to assume that our capacity products are only 50% deliverable, this problem grows with the introduction of imbalance reserves in the day-ahead time frame. Based on the current day-ahead market enhancements proposal, we believe the imbalance reserves will be a biddable product. Therefore, there will be a higher cost associated with procurement of imbalance reserves. And we also anticipate procuring a larger amount of imbalance reserves in the day-ahead time frame. So if we procure 4,000 megawatts in the up or downward direction, and it is a biddable product, and only 50% of that is deliverable, there are now larger impacts to this capacity deliverability problem. If we continue down the waterfall chart one more time to EDAM, and we think about having imbalance reserves within the EDAM footprint, the problem grows again. One of the main drivers for the benefits of an extended day-ahead market design is that imbalance reserves will allow energy imbalance entities that are participating in EDAM to procure or buy imbalance reserves from other EIM entities. And the idea here is that you could use this imbalance product from one EIM entity to resolve your own imbalances and therefore not need to have as much unit commitment within your own territory. And this is the primary driver behind the cost-benefit analysis for EDAM. But let's assume we don't have guarantee of deliverability of our imbalance reserves. Well, if you're an EIM entity and you're buying imbalance reserves from another entity, but you don't have a guarantee it's deliverable, you likely won't be confident enough to avoid unit commitment of one of your own resources to meet imbalance. So therefore, you're going to have to commit resources like you do today unless we can ensure imbalance reserves are fully deliverable. So again, under the construct of EDAM, with your procurement of more biddable imbalance reserves, the cost impact grows. So the CAISO has decided to prioritize the deliverability or improvement of deliverability for our capacity products, which we believe will improve our market efficiencies, as was identified in the price performance analysis, and will also aid in operational challenges that our operators face today. Before we move specifically to the day-ahead market enhancements, are there any slides on the cost impact of undeliverable capacity products in the CAISO market?
Just a reminder, folks, for any questions, please push pound 2.
All right, on to our next slide. The day-ahead market enhancements. This effort began last year in 2018 and is intended to address imbalance and uncertainty needs that occur between the day-ahead and the real-time market. The purpose of the day-ahead market is to correctly position and commit resources so the CAISO has adequate bids into the real-time market and ramping capability into the real-time market to meet any imbalances that can occur. And we are planning to introduce a new capacity product, as I hinted at on the previous slide. We're naming this new capacity product Imbalance Reserves, and we believe Imbalance Reserves will improve market efficiency, will also ensure that we have the correct units committed in the day-ahead time frame, and this will allow us to address the steep net ramps and imbalance and uncertainty that are growing throughout the past years. We plan to co-optimize this new Imbalance Reserve capacity product with the procurement of our energy and believe we will now be able to adequately compensate all resources for the products they are providing to our day-ahead and real-time markets. And that's all I have for a quick synopsis of the day-ahead market enhancement. So next I'll pass it over to Brad Cooper to talk about EDAM.
Okay, extending the day-ahead market to EIM entities, or as it's also referred to, EDAM. The intent of that initiative is to create a regional market, to create regional benefits. It would differ from the current day-ahead market in that the participants in this extended market would have the options just to participate in the market and not become full-fledged members of the CAISO balancing authority area. As such, they would maintain authority over their reliability responsibilities, and the individual states would maintain control over their own integrated resource planning while providing the benefits of them able to participate in the day-ahead market and take advantage of the enhanced unit commitment and the other benefits of the day-ahead market. Next slide. We just put out our issue paper on this, and we are reviewing all the comments, but the topics we're going to have to address in this initiative include how we make transmission available to the extended day-ahead market and recover costs, how the day-ahead resource sufficiency evaluation would work, what we would do about distributing congestion revenues, full network model enhancements, determining how a GHG attribution would work in the day-ahead market, and especially for multiple states with GHG obligations. And then a related initiative will look at governance to account for the larger market scope of the EIM, potential governance changes. Moving on to the next slide, an initiative that CAISO is added on for 2021 that was primarily having to do with operational concerns regarding the new nature of the fleet. This initiative would look at ways to manage ramp rates to better control system balance, particularly for intermittent resource, particularly solar ramp rates that can be very high today, enhancing the market incentives to better provide accurate curtailment response, looking at a couple market power issues having to do with the need to dispatch resources down, or as referred to on the slide, decremental market power, and then potential rule changes to improve intertie liquidity. And I won't get into these in detail since we've talked about them a number of times before, so we can move on to the resource adequacy piece.
All right. Good afternoon. This is John Gooden. Talk about a couple of initiatives, resource adequacy and energy storage and distributed energy resources. As far as resource adequacy, again, these principles are the same as we've conveyed before in the roadmap and also in the stakeholder initiative. But just briefly, again, we're looking at our RA Enhancements Initiative to see how the RA framework must evolve to reflect some of the needs of the grid as we grow more dependent on variable and intermittent resources that have use limitations. So we need to understand how RA works in that under that paradigm. As far as RA accounting rules, we want to evaluate RA accounting rules and make sure that we procure the most dependable, reliable, and effective resources that meet the needs of the evolving grid. Third, the RA program, we want to ensure that it incentivizes the showing of all RA resources, that there's no incentives to hold back the showing of RA capacity. We want to be able to use all of the RA capacity that's available to us to best optimize the market. And fourth and finally, a very important theme is ensuring that the RA fleet is capable of meeting load all hours of the year, evolving the RA paradigm from just a pure capacity stacking to meet the peak load of the hour of the year to ensuring that RA capacity has sufficient energy behind it to meet the load needs of the grid all hours. So those are our four key principles. Again, those haven't changed and are still guiding the work we're doing in this initiative. Next slide. As far as the enhancements and sort of the phasing of the resource adequacy initiative, again, I won't go through all the details here. This has not changed. I'll only highlight that in 2020, the maximum import capability enhancements has been spun off into its own initiative, and so there's some information out there about this particular initiative and the proposal, the straw proposal that will be coming out for this and upcoming meetings, and also the slow demand response. Again, these are sort of fast-tracked and early implementation here this next year, fall, ahead of all the other RA enhancements for implementation 2020 for RA year 2021. And so that's the other point I'll make, is that these dates you see here are implementation, or when we will implement, typically in the fall, which means that it wouldn't be applicable until that next RA cycle. So I'll just open up to see if there's any questions on the RA program enhancements and roadmap.
John, operator, I'm not seeing questions by end thus far, unless you're seeing something on your end.
We have no questions at this time.
Very good. Okay, Jimmy, let's advance to shape electric sector decentralization. Again, two aspects on this is our ESDR initiative, and then some work that we plan to do with stakeholders on the T&D interface. And let's start with the ESDR initiative. Again, we've been teeing up some specific elements to try to reduce barriers to demand response and DER participation. For example, thanks. Yeah, got it. We're trying to expand the modeling to capture the value of DER and storage modeling, where we're looking at a state of charge parameter for our non-generated resource. So we're looking at end of day state of charge for NGR for those that have been following the initiative. And also on the DR front, we've been looking at a max daily runtime parameter that we want to build, and that would be for DR resources that are equal to or greater than a megawatt. So again, details on this can be found in the ESDR initiative. We also are looking at default energy bids for storage resources. Just as an FYI, we do have a working group tomorrow to dig into some of the technical details around the default energy bid for storage. So if you're interested in that, please tune in if you haven't already. Again, we're going to have a whole day working on these details and fleshing out these details around the default energy bid for storage. Third, we're developing market participation rules to inform what the qualifying capacity counting is for DR. Most DR actually has a variable nature, and so we're looking at how do we appropriately value demand response that is variable, like other variable resources, looking at an effective load carrying capability methodology to assess what that qualifying capacity value should be for DR that has a variable nature. And then finally, under the ESDR initiative, we were considering a non-24/7 settlement for NGR resources based on the last stakeholder meeting. You'll note that we are waiting on that one, waiting for the local regulatory authority, in particular the PUC, and the IOUs as the distribution companies to address some of those fundamental issues around DR and DERs participating in the market under a multi-use application paradigm. So we're deferring that for now, that element. Okay, next slide. That's it for ESDR. Let's talk about our hybrid resources initiative. Again, addressing some of the challenges that we have of how hybrid resources, things like storage and solar paired together, how we allow those resources to participate in the market and maximize the benefits that they provide. So we're looking at several things. Again, looking at the model around hybrid resources. Again, how do we minimize barriers to their participation, how we forecast these types of resources, given the challenge that you have a variable resource paired with something like a battery that can actually address the variability of the solar or the variable energy resource tied to it, so that's tricky. We're also looking at developing a point of interconnection constraint in the future here for hybrid resources, evaluating metering and telemetry requirements, and then what are the qualifying capacity rules and must-offer obligations for hybrid resources. So again, those that have been tracking this particular initiative and activity at the PUC will note that the PUC did come out with a proposed decision about the QC for hybrid resources as an interim step. But again, that's something that we all, I think, want to continue to work on to further refine how we do value and count hybrid resources. So more to follow on that in our initiative and at the PUC. And so finally, I'll wrap up with the T&D interface initiative. We're going to be looking at, thanks, Jimmy, more? Thanks. We're going to be looking at how to effectively coordinate between the ISO and the DSO at that T&D interface. What are those roles and responsibilities at the T&D interface between the ISO, the distribution utilities, DER providers, so that we can ensure, the efficient operation of the grid. So we want to investigate models for forecasting, managing, and operating DERs to meet whatever standards are both on the transmission side, on the distribution side of the interface. Also consider what some of the data and data frequency that has to be reported at between the ISO and DSO to ensure that safe and reliable operation. So the ISO is having some interim meetings and initial meetings with the distribution operators at the utilities to try to sort of frame up these issues so that we can explore these further with stakeholders here next year. So with that, I will wrap up my section and see if there's any questions on this segment of my presentation. Jim, any questions?
Yeah, thanks, John. Looks like we do have at least one question that popped up. Operator, please feel free to open the line.
Hey, John. Steve Greenway for CES. Just a quick question. Have you guys contemplated how you're going to address FERC's order on 841? just from a process standpoint, is that going to be, strictly, whatever, a compliance filing, or do you kind of anticipate some of the issues being fed back to ESER 4?
I think, Steve, it'll largely be done as a compliance filing. They raised, I think, about 4 issues FERC did in our compliance. And largely, again, reducing the size of the resource that can qualify for AS under as a distributed energy resource. Again, that's pretty straightforward. That's easily done on compliance. And then some of that metering, they raised a couple of metering issues. And so, again, as you know, typically we're just trying to adhere to FERC's order on compliance. I don't anticipate any formal stakeholdering, but again, I think we have to discuss it internally more to see if there is additional stakeholdering that's necessary. So for now,
okay,
it's going to be more.
Yeah, I was just, in particular, I was curious about some of the wholesale retail issues they raise and whether that would require you to kind of go back and develop, further develop some of the policy.
I think it's interesting, Steve. I think FERC maybe doesn't understand it fully as far as how they issue this compliance, because this is for in front of the meter DER, and so this whole notion that there is sort of this interaction between retail and wholesale is a little bit hard to understand, because as in front of the meter, which is how FERC has designed 841, that's purely wholesale and likely subject to WDATs rather than sort of a commingling of retail and wholesale. So that's why I think that we have to have some further discussion internally about this, because I think there's a little confusion in FERC about what they've ordered.
Okay. Well, and that's helpful. So I take it from that the CAISO will obviously consider requests for rehearing or clarification in the first instance. So, okay. Well, thank you. That helps.
Okay.
Thanks, John.
All right. Thanks, Steve. Any other questions?
No further questions on my end, operator. I was just seeing something in your end.
We have no further questions at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we'll now wrap it up with the roadmap and annual plan. A little background information to get us started. We've indicated that we're changing our policy development process going forward. Under our current approach, we essentially run through the stakeholder process, bring the policy to the Board of Governors, and then move forward in developing both the tariff languages as well as the business requirements. In that process, a lot of the policy details are further worked out. But we've seen some issues with this process in the past, and we think that going forward, a much better process would be to essentially complete the stakeholder process with the high-level policy, then work through at least a draft of both the tariff as well as the business requirements, because that would help to identify any potential gaps in the policy that was developed that would then be able to more flexibly address those issues prior to taking it to the board, and it would also provide greater transparency as to how we expect the policy to ultimately be implemented. And this affects the roadmap in that you'll see somewhat longer policy development timelines than what we've seen in the past, but on an overall project basis, this doesn't mean they're taking longer. It's just that we're putting in prior to what we considered more of an implementation effort as part of the policy development now going. So next, we also have a few initiatives again on the roadmap this year that are flagged as potential initiatives, meaning that we're still in the analysis phase to determine whether or not they warrant an actual policy initiative. When we went over this last time, we had 3 categories of those initiatives: system market power, congestion revenue rights, and the real-time settlement review. We have made some progress on the system market power. We've now, if you'll notice, a change on that in the roadmap. For the final roadmap that we've actually committed to at least the first phase of development for measures for the real-time market for system market power, and we're also anticipating a second phase where we would consider further enhancements to include both the day-ahead market as well as the EIM areas. We're still, though, in the analysis phase on the congestion revenue rights market. We're continuing to analyze how those markets are performing going forward. We think it's beneficial at this point to continue to collect more data and work to also evolve some of the monitoring that we're doing on CRR market performance, as well as developing some additional metrics that will help inform how those markets are working. So we'll continue to look at that prior to determining whether we need further changes to the CRR markets, but I think it's pretty safe to say at this point we don't see that we need the wholesale changes that we did back in 2018. We don't see that level of changes necessary going forward, but there may be some additional enhancements that we could make to those markets. And then finally, the real-time settlement review. This was something that we committed to during the real-time imbalance energy offset initiative that we ran earlier this year, and we committed to doing a holistic look at real-time charge codes and how those are allocated out. And if we do identify that there's any issues, we would then prioritize those on their impacts as to whether they needed to be addressed immediately or whether they could be added to the scope of the planned initiative that we have in 2022 on the real-time market and EIM refinements. So with that, I'll switch over to showing the 3-year policy roadmap. This again shows the major initiatives that we have planned over the next 3 years. The boxes show the time frames that we estimate for the policy development, and then the diamonds are our estimates of implementation. I think we're a little more firm on the policy development timelines than the implementation dates. These are, again, just estimates at this time, but until we finish the entire policy development, we really don't have a firm grasp on what the impact would be on implementation, but this is what we're currently targeting, as a lot of these initiatives are dependent on one another. I'm going to focus primarily on the changes that we made in the final roadmap as to what we proposed in the draft roadmap. You've already heard about a lot of the initiatives that we have planned for the next 3 years. One of the changes that we've made from the draft roadmap to this one is that we have lengthened the policy development timeline for extending the day-ahead market to EIM entities. We recently received the comments on our issue paper, and many of the stakeholders requested that we allow additional time between iterations of the policy development to allow greater coordination and consideration on their side, which we have. We think that's a good idea, and we'll agree to accommodate that, but that will result in a longer policy development timeline. We've also taken off the estimated implementation date because, again, that will somewhat be dependent on what's ultimately designed as well as when the policy development is concluded. I'll also comment, we've got the Order 831 import bidding and market parameters scheduled to be implemented in the fall of 2020. That is essentially going to be coordinated with when we're raising the bid cap up to $2,000. We did make a compliance filing with FERC that we would be, our intentions are to raise the bid cap to $2,000 in the fall of 2020. We asked for the extension in the time to do that to allow for this policy development. In the event that we don't believe we can have this policy development implemented by that time frame, we would be looking to amend that filing with FERC and ask for a later implementation date, just so everybody's clear on our intentions there. Finally, CRR Track 2, again, as I mentioned, we're still evaluating the market performance there. We haven't committed to making any changes in that area as of now. We'll continue to do that. At least our anticipation is through mid next year. The system market power phase 1, as I mentioned, that has now been changed from a initiative under consideration to one that we're committing to doing. We're actually starting that and looking to put out our straw proposal next week, so be looking for that. And that wraps up the changes that we had from the draft 3-year plan that we put out earlier, and the rest of these initiatives I think we pretty much went over with the presentations by Megan, Brad, and John. So with that, I'll jump to the annual plan on the next page. Here we have a couple of additional initiatives that weren't included in the 3-year roadmap, in particular the maximum import capability enhancements. We're looking at getting an issue paper out on that this week, I believe, so that initiative will be starting. Again, we're trying to get that completed relatively quickly so it can be implemented later next year. And finally, I also talked about the Order 831, import bidding and market parameters. Again, if that initiative ends up taking longer or the ultimate policy design takes longer to implement, well, again, we would ask FERC to extend the time frame for when we would actually be raising the bid cap from $1,000 to $2,000. And, with that, the rest of the annual plan is pretty much the same as it was, other than we also have the system market power mitigation that we're trying to get completed in time so that we can have whatever design comes out of that implemented prior to the summer of 2020 is our goal. So right now we're targeting the fall of 2020, but that could potentially push to the spring of 2021, but the ultimate goal there is just to get it in place prior to summer of 2021. So that is the look at the 3-year annual plan and the 2020 draft annual plan, and be happy to answer any questions on either of those.
Thanks, Greg. Seeing no questions, folks, we encourage feedback. Please push #2. All right, hearing no questions, thanks, Greg. Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, folks. Please look for the final roadmap to be briefed at our Board of Governors on the December Board of Governors date, which is December 19th, around the corner, as well as the next AIM governing body briefing on January 22nd of 2020. With that, folks, thank you so much for your time, and of course, please have a great rest of your day. You can look out for the recording for this session to be available within the next couple of business days. Thanks so much.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using AT&T Event Conferencing Enhanced. You may now disconnect.